So hi, my name is Martin Morberg. I am Northern Shoshone and Tlingit. I identify as a Two-Spirit man. I belong to the First Nation of Nalchinayak Dan, and I was born and raised in the Yukon Territory. I belong to the Doklawady clan, which translates to the Eagle Killer Whale Crest. And I am an Indigenous HIV activist. Here interviewing Trevor today, if you want to introduce yourself.
Well, hello, Martin. It's great to see your beautiful face. Yeah, I am Trevor Stratton, and I've been living with HIV for 31 years, at least that I've known of since I've been tested. I'm a citizen of the Mississaugas of the Credit River First Nation, and I live in my territory, the Dish with One Spoon territory, which we share with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, as well as Métis and Inuit and people from all over the world. So yeah, that's where I'm coming from here in Ontario.
Nice. So, Trevor, I was wondering if you could tell me a bit about yourself and the work that you do as a coordinator for the International Indigenous Working Group on HIV and AIDS.
Yeah, I'm also a two-spirit man. I'm of the bisexual or maybe even pansexual variety. Yeah, I'm the coordinator of the International Indigenous Working Group on HIV and AIDS. And I came to this work with an organization called CAN. And CAN was recently renamed. It used to be the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network. And we kept the same acronym. And now we're Communities, Alliances, and Networks. So we're still CAAN. And CAN is the host of the International Indigenous Working Group on HIV and AIDS. For at least almost the next 2 years. And then that funding will end. And then an organization, which is a pretty new NGO, a non-governmental organization called the International Indigenous HIV and AIDS Community, will take over the work from IGWA and lead the international response for Indigenous peoples in HIV from that moment forward. IGWA is what we call the International Working Group on HIV. And IGWA has gone a lot of different places. We, next year at AIDS 2022 in Montreal, the International AIDS Conference, we will be hosting our 9th International Indigenous Pre-Conference on HIV and AIDS, which is a 2-day conference before the International AIDS Conference, which is like the AIDS Olympics of the world, which is a 5-day long conference in Montreal. I hope I see you there, Martin. But we also engage at UNAIDS, at the United Nations, the Joint United Nations Program on HIV and AIDS. We go to New York City to the UN as well, to the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And we were recently engaged in the high-level meeting on ending AIDS at the UN. And we have a new political declaration now, so.
Nice. So I've been an activist now in the HIV field and Indigenous communities for about 5.5 years. And, you know, it's always been Indigenous leaders like yourself that have role modeled to me and that I've really looked up to. And so I'm just wondering if you can tell me a little bit about, you know, the beginning of your activism and kind of a brief summary of what led you to, you know, going from something more community-based to regional to national that led to your international work. And if you can give, you know, if you were to say anything to like a young Indigenous activist here in Canada, you know, if you would give them any advice, what would you say to them?
Wow, you know, things have changed so much, Martin, so much in the world of HIV. Because in 1990, when I was diagnosed, friends all around me were dying. They were getting really, really sick and skinny and dying in really, really sad ways. And often they would die alone because of the great amount of stigma and the discrimination that people living with HIV were experiencing. And for Indigenous peoples, we were even further behind. And we had the extra layers of, you know, so our socioeconomic status and you know, color of our skin. So I think it was a bit harder for people who looked a little different than the mainstream Canadian, European, Canadian settlers. It was harder on us because not only did we have the HIV stigma, but we had all these other intersecting stigmas piled on top of us. When I was diagnosed, it was pretty darn lonely. But, you know, in 1996, they came out with the new antiretroviral medications, the ARVs, the cocktails, drug cocktails, which I didn't take at first because I still didn't trust institutions in Canada from my Indigenous upbringing. So it took me a while. I actually almost died of AIDS before I went on the medication. But it was my son and my wife at the time, I was married back then, that convinced me to get off the couch and get down and you know, get my T4s counted and to get on the meds. And I got off my deathbed and I started to become an activist, but that was 7 or 8 years after my diagnosis. I can say, I guess, if there was advice, because I know there's other Indigenous people who are afraid of reaching out or asking for help. And I would say, please reach out and 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 try to, you know, go get a test. Or if you think you've taken some risky behavior, go get tested. And if you end up testing positive, then get on medications, because HIV isn't a death sentence anymore. That's my advice to young people. You can live a long, healthy, productive life just like anybody else. If you get on the medications and take them every day, you can be as strong and healthy as anybody else. So reach out, because we're here and we want to help.
Okay, nice. So I was just wondering too, like, as a millennial myself, I've been living with HIV for 9 years, and the ARVs were available to me in 2012. And so I've never felt the wrath of HIV/AIDS. I was very fortunate to have the medication available to me right away. And when I got into activism, it actually took me a couple of years to realize the generational difference between some of the social justice fighting that had to take place in the 80s and 90s around the liberation of people living with HIV. So, you know, back in the 80s and 90s, it was very scary and was deemed, you know, a death sentence. And so now we have these millennials, you know, in 2021 who, you know, have ARVs available to them. You know, people are aware of, you know, undetectable equals untransmittable. We're also aware of, you know, PrEP and like HIV prevention and, you know, treatment as prevention. So I'm just wondering, like, for myself, it was really beneficial for me to learn more about the history of HIV, you know, the lives that had to be lost, the social justice that took place, and like really fighting for the space to be heard, to be seen, and to be treated as people living with HIV. And so I think it's really important for young people to know today about how or why we experience the liberty that we have today and kind of historically where that comes from. So I'm just wondering if you can comment and maybe bridge that gap a little bit.
Yeah, we didn't have long-term injectable antiretroviral medications back then, you know, or home testing for HIV. We never had any of that. I wasn't part of the, you know, the very first responders to HIV as early as, you know, the earlier mid 80s. Those were my mentors. I came in right around the time, right around 1990 when I tested positive, when I really started to get more active. But I was involved in some of those street demonstrations in Toronto and elsewhere. And I remember, you know, particularly gay pride used to be more of a political demonstration than it was a celebration of being proud. It was both, but it was so much stronger, the political piece, because we were fighting so hard for those rights, those gay rights, or the right to express ourselves or love who we wanted to. And then just after the sexual revolution of the 70s, you know, the 60s and the 70s, came HIV. And that was quite a setback to the gay liberation movement and to just the concept of free love. And it changed a lot of people. I remember seeing gay pride on the floats. You know, some of our heroes, our HIV activist heroes, were, you know, elevated way up and waving, and people were crying and cheering, cheering them on. And you know, they'd have the Kaposi sarcoma, you know, the purple lesions, and very skinny and frail. And 6 months later, they'd be gone. I forgot, Martin, how desperate we were. We were terrified. We were desperate. it's so different now. And the antiretrovirals, and that the world ignored us at first, but it was those demonstrations and demanding to be heard and demanding that they stop talking about how are we going to protect ourselves from those people and start talking about us as human beings, and how are we going to take care of our families and our relatives and our children and our uncles and aunties. And it was a tough time. And I wonder now, like, I know why I'm still here, because I was traumatized, and I still carry that with me. But I'm my hat's really off, and I have to really commend the young people who never went through that experience, and yet they are super motivated to be activists and to be responding and standing along with us together.
Yeah, thank you for that, Trevor. I just think it's really important for, the millennials and newer generations to have an understanding of, some of those radical demonstrations and protests and the fight of social justice and the lives that were lost in order to get where we are today, right? It's like we have freedom, we have liberty, we have ARVs, U equals U, we have PrEP and all these other like alternatives to treat HIV or HIV prevention. And I think it's really important, for us to understand that it wasn't always like this, that there was radical and desperate protests and demonstrations that needed to take place, and like actually was a community of people that really came together to make these things possible.
Yeah.
So just looking at some of the statistics here in Canada. So, Indigenous people are disproportionately affected by HIV. In 2018, Indigenous individuals made up 14% of all new HIV cases in Canada, but are only 5% of Canada's total population. Can you maybe elaborate on some of the reasons for this?
Yeah. Indigenous people seem to be first in line for things that nobody wants, and we're last in line for the things that everybody wants. And the reasons are really around our socioeconomic status, and really the whole colonization thing. It didn't help us. These institutions that were brought in from foreign lands, they weren't made for us. They weren't designed with Indigenous peoples in mind. Hospitals and schools, and these were for Europeans. And the assimilation of Indigenous people, it was never done to make us into lawyers and doctors and parliamentarians and leaders. We were supposed to be incorporated as subservient, as servants. And all of the diseases that came in from Europe, and I don't just mean smallpox and the physical diseases. I'm talking about alcoholism, and I'm talking about homophobia. These diseases didn't come from us. They weren't here before. And we were new to all these new diseases. Our bodies were naive to these diseases, and these diseases swept over our communities and did a lot of harm. And they caused a lot of long-lasting trauma, in addition to the discrimination the loss of our land, the loss of our languages, and a lot of these negative things caused multi-generational trauma. There's a lot of positive things, a lot of healthy things about Indigenous peoples, but we are living the legacy of colonization, and it has really done a disservice to our health and our well-being. And I must say that, even to the European settlers, they are also living the legacy of the residential school system. We are all living this legacy. We're all treaty people. We have to fix this together. No one side can do it alone. We need each other.
Yeah, it's always been my own thoughts too, that like HIV is not the problem, and it's, a symptom or a result of a much deeper rooted issue that stems from things like colonization and assimilation, which leads to intergenerational trauma. And in that trauma, having the intergenerational impacts and social determinants of health that make Indigenous people vulnerable to things like HIV. So me looking at HIV in a holistic way its actual origin stems from the colonization, the intergenerational impacts, and which resulted in the social determinants of health. So, which make us vulnerable to, a variety of diseases, as you were speaking of, you know, also the mental disease of stigma and discrimination and the intersections, as someone like myself, being a two-spirit, mixed heritage, former person who used drugs, so there's things like homophobia, racism, drug user stigma, you know, um, HIV stigma, and then you try and navigate through these like very colonial structures like the healthcare system, the justice system, the education system, and then you're often faced in a space where you actually have to defend your very existence in order, to fight for that space to get the access that you need. So it's people are aware of this. Like we are aware of the intergenerational traumas and the results of that, and how Indigenous people are disproportionately affected by HIV here in Canada. So on the other end of that spectrum, I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit about intergenerational resilience, intergenerational strength, and like reclamation of two-spirit identity. Also, can you highlight some of the positive work that is being done within the Indigenous HIV field here in Canada and maybe internationally?
In my own case, I remember as a child asking my grandparents, asking my grandma, she's Mohawk, can you remember anything traditionally Indigenous that you used to do, or your parents or your grandparents used to do, or did you used to speak your language? Do you know any ceremonies? And she said, no, don't ever ask me that again. That's devil's worship. That's devil talk. And when she heard that I had gay friends, she said that I was possessed by the demon of lust. And so I carried that with me. And when it's funny, it was hard for me to learn about my culture within my own family because it was so stigmatized internally. My family sort of wasn't all that proud of the ancestry and our heritage, our traditional heritage, especially since after converting to Christianity. And so it wasn't until I came to Toronto when I was realizing, hey, I'm interested in men too. And I used to go to some gay bars looking around to see if I could find someone to hang out with. And then I started to get to know people, and there's a few people I'd go over and talk to these Indigenous guys, and they say, hey, we want you to meet somebody. And there's these two big guys started walking toward me. They looked like, I tell this story a lot, looked like big bikers. And one said, hi, I'm Muffin. Great, big, beautiful man. And they were leaders in the Two-Spirit community in Toronto. And I started hanging out with them, and they started teaching me that the Two-Spirit traditions and how each community or each culture had their own way of looking at these middle genders. And we had Two-Spirit people had our own roles and responsibilities, and in some cases our own dialects and our own songs. And I thought, wow. And that the fact that we were revered and families considered themselves lucky to have a Two-Spirit person in their family. And I started to learn about traditions. I started to get invited to ceremonies, and I know it sounds really weird, but I started learning who I am as an Indigenous person in like a leather and denim bar in downtown Toronto, which is my traditional territory. But two-spirited people began to do for others what they had done for me, exactly the same thing, so that we took pride in being two-spirit or being Indigenous LGBT, and that we were actually quite extraordinary and special in our communities, and that we had a special role to help our communities because we were mediators. We're these middle people. We live in a middle place. And one of the things we do as well is engage with non-Indigenous communities and the Indigenous community and play mediator roles and people would love us to come and pray and bless babies and come and if a man and a woman were having relationship troubles, they'd bring a two-spirit person in because we understood how both spirits sort of worked, and we were able to work in that middle place.
Yeah, I think part of the Western settler ideologies of like gender roles is like the cookie cutter of, male, female. And, this is what is expected from both of those roles. This is what it's acceptable. And they brought that with them to Turtle Island and then impressed that upon us and created shame for anybody that was outside of these cookie cutter roles. When you look at the vast spectrum of human sexuality, gender identity, it's near impossible to fit even Western settlers into those cookie cutter roles, never mind Indigenous people and Two-Spirit people. And so I just wanted to add too that it was a lot of my Two-Spirit aunties and elders and community members that really nurtured me with their stories. Being a young queer man, of Indigenous ancestry, moving from a remote community into an urban setting, suffering a lot, looking for my place in the community, and actually, doing a lot of damage to my spirit along the way, trying to find the place that I fit. And it was when I was diagnosed with HIV and I was being invited to these national conferences and forums and events, and I started to get into activism, that it was like I started to meet people like Trevor Stratton and, Doris Peltier and, Gail Pruden and, Dwayne Morso. And, there's just this long list of these national, Two-Spirit leading activists that just like loved me and nurtured me. And, within the Two-Spirit realm, I always make sure to be really inclusive of our Indigenous women and the power that they hold and how they've loved us and nurtured us. And, ally wouldn't even be the word. It's more like the mother, the aunties, the grandmothers that loved us and really helped us reclaim our space and fight for our space as Two-Spirit people. So I just wanted to move on a little bit about the new self-test kit that's been approved in Canada recently. And so there seems to be this idea from like these leading organizations and researchers that this is going to fill the gaps of, the barriers of accessing to testing, and that this will be embraced by Indigenous communities. Well, we know how well colonial structures and solutions work when forced upon Indigenous communities. So, there's these colonial frameworks, with these non-Indigenous folks. They go into Indigenous community and say, we have your solution. And this is how it's going to work. This is how we're going to fill the gaps to your barriers to accessing testing and healthcare. Much more complex than that. And so, I think in order to successfully disseminate these self-test kits into Indigenous communities, it's like experts from those communities need to be at the decision-making tables. How can we take an Indigenous approach to invite these communities to come to the decision-making tables, to build that relationship, and to offer our Indigenous sexual health resources to them in the way that they can self-determine what is best for them. And so I'm just wondering, like, if you have any comments on that, or if you can maybe give some insight on like how can leading national organizations support Indigenous communities in creating pathways to accessing self-test kits, and how can they do it in a way that is Indigenous-led, that is peer-led, that is self-determined by Indigenous people, without bringing their agendas of this extractive kind of research that they take from Indigenous people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the starting place is to forget about the notion that all Indigenous peoples are the same. There's so much diversity in the Indigenous communities. And I mean, I'm not just talking about First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Within First Nations, there's so much diversity. The differences between your communities and communities where I'm from, it's huge. When we get together, we're just in awe of each other's languages and ceremonies and cultural practices, all of it. It's just so different. There are commonalities where we honor Mother Earth and the connection, everything is connected, but there's so much diversity. So that's the first thing I think, that each community is at a different place, and you need to start where a community's at. The only way to do that is to walk with them for a little ways. If you're going to provide services to an individual, you need to walk with them and get to know them and develop that trust and rapport, and get to know each other and develop a relationship. And that's the same with communities. There's almost approximately 600 First Nations in Canada. They're all different. They're all at different stages of development, or stages or understanding of this or that, or their cultural framework is different. And I mean, I work internationally, so they're trying to teach sexual health to Indigenous peoples by showing big pictures of genitalia with a stick and pointing out and getting them to name each part. That's not the way we teach in sexual health with Indigenous. It's more through storytelling and through our ceremonies and our traditional ways of seeing the world, our worldview. And the HIV context is different within Indigenous communities as well. I mean, in mainstream Canada, what is it? Just around over 20% of new infections are in women. In the Indigenous community, it's almost half. In the mainstream community, it's a little over around 60% of people who get HIV are men who have sex with men. In the Indigenous community, the number one mode of transmission is injection drug use. And then the second mode of transmission is heterosexual sex. And it's the third that's men who have sex with men. So if we're making just all of these two-spirit posters and everything, and we're sending them all to reserves, and we're focusing on the MSM community, we're missing half of our community, the women with children who are getting barred from school because of stigma and discrimination and things like this. So, understanding where each community's at is key.
I think I really love the simplicity of, walk with us. It's almost a hashtag. You know what I mean? Because it's so true for us. It was like anybody that had, a really influential kind of impact on me, and some really like pivotal moments in my own recovery and learning and embracing HIV as a teacher has come from people that have lived through it, that have built relationships with me, that have nurtured me and empowered me with knowledge through, storytelling, or, relationship building, or, listening to the needs that I have, in accessing sexual health care. And so, I really appreciate, the self-determination, and the community engagement and relationship building. And, it was Albert Marshall, the Mi'kmaq elder, who gifted us with the two-eyed seeing concept, right? It's like we could see with the Western knowledge and sexual health resources. So thinking about, U equals U, PrEP, self-test kit, all of this really important information and really effective treatment and testing that saves lives. But it's like in the other eye, we see through this Indigenous lens of like our ceremony, our elders, our two-spirit community members, our stories, like our traditional medicines, like our ceremonies, and all of these things that make us strong and powerful as Indigenous people, that is still alive today, that people are fighting to keep alive. And so when we look through both of these eyes, it really can be for the benefit of all. But it's like, it's not Indigenous people's responsibility to do this two-eyed seeing. It's more of a reconciliation. So if it were to be, a set of glasses, it was like every Westerner and every Indigenous person sitting at the decision-making table should put on this two-eyed seeing set of glasses in order to really draw from the strengths of both worlds for the benefit of Indigenous communities and that relationship building. And like, how do we equip and empower other Indigenous people to do this important work in their own communities, because they are the experts of their own experience, of their own communities, of their own stories, of their own elders, ceremonies, traditions, cultures. And it's like, that's I believe would be a start to creating pathways to things like a self-test kit. And thank God for elders like Albert Marshall who have gifted us these things, two-eyed seeing concept, the two-spirit event that coined the term two-spirit, that gave us an identity in the 90s, that, young people like myself, after struggling in the urban setting for how long, was able to reclaim my identity as an Indigenous person, as a two-spirit person. And it was often, role models and leaders like yourself that broke trail for younger people like me to come in and to pick up the torch and, keep leading the way and breaking trail for like the baby two-spirits that are coming. So I just wanted to close with this. What does reconciliation look like? And who is accountable for making sure we achieve reconciliation? And what advice would you give to non-Indigenous allies who are looking for a starting point and moving towards reconciliation?
I think all through this conversation, the word that we haven't actually spoken, that we seem to be dancing all around, is trust. There is a lack of trust on both sides, I think. And reconciliation, I think, is about that trust, or taking that ethical space between two people and finding some common ground, a common way of speaking about what's going on. How do we look back on, over 500 years of colonization and ongoing? I mean, it's still going. How do we look at it and go, okay, this is what happened, and here's how it's still happening, the evolution of colonization. What steps can we take to undo this together? And that's a whole lot of trust there. And when we're talking about these new technologies for HIV and people knocking at the door with another book that, here, this will solve your problems. You just follow those instructions, everything will be fine. We've had that so often that when we come to the door with long-term injectable ARVs, self-testing, all PrEP, do we trust it? Really, do we trust it? That's what we have to address. It's the trust. And the only way, and we've already talked about it, it's about walking with Indigenous people and make a friend, get to know somebody, ask them some questions, and be a little vulnerable yourself. And there's so much animosity and mistrust between the two groups. I mean, it's not just Indigenous people not trusting the government. The government doesn't trust Indigenous people either. Indigenous people aren't just asking for help. We have a lot to offer this world. And we, if we're allowed at the table, we will help. We will help. We love this earth. We love all of humanity. Let us help. That's reconciliation. Let us be part of the solution. That's what I can say.
Yeah, I just want to just a closing comment on that. I think it's really important for Western settlers to actually acknowledge the historical impacts of colonization and assimilation of Turtle Island's Indigenous people, to acknowledge that this took place and that this is not a personal attack. So the fragility is not needed or even welcomed. This is identifying that these Western settlers are still benefiting from the structures that were created and built by their ancestors that still negatively impact and oppress and marginalize Indigenous people here in Canada. So also too is, Indigenous voices. Like, we're not a trend. Reconciliation is not a trend. This is the lives of Indigenous people. And I think it's really important for anybody that has experienced or is like the descendants of any culture that's experienced genocide, is what have they experienced in their lives that brought them to the point that they are today? And to really approach that with like an open mind and a willingness to learn. It's like, we're not a trend. We are, the grandchildren of the Indians that they were not able to destroy, right? And we're here to reclaim, parts of our culture and, to move forward. And so I think it's really important for people to understand this is not personal. We're not trying to attack your fragility. This is about empowering Indigenous nations throughout Turtle Island. And I think it's important to acknowledge and, be accountable for the historical trauma that was imposed upon Indigenous people, and, to create space for Indigenous voices to be heard, for us to be visible, like in these, leading movements around, HIV here in Canada, and like reconciliation. So that's just my 2 cents.
There's 30 years age difference between us, and we think a lot alike. You know that, Martin?
Yeah, well, I've had a lot of really like deadly aunties around Canada.